Though gender considerations are recognized as important to the success of EBA, there's limited evidence to date that EBA initiatives have systematically taken a gender-responsive approach, which goes beyond sensitivity to actively addressing gender inequalities. With an eye to filling exactly this gap, the GIZ Global Project Mainstreaming EBA and IISD have worked together over the last couple of months to develop a report that addresses why gender is so important for EBA in policy and in practice, and that shows in compelling examples how gender considerations can be included in your work. The report was launched very shortly before this event, and we are very, very happy that we're able to share a link to the document with you later on in this session. So please stay with us until the very end, because that's when we're going to share the link to this new report with you. We will hear more about the report in a moment, and we could with this move on to the agenda. In which you can see that the report is a core point, because we will start with Angie Dazé from IISD giving an overview over the just mentioned document. After that, we'll have a first Mentimeter poll prepared for you, which is then followed by an interview with Manorama Sunuwar from CARE Nepal, who will share her experience with integrating gender into her project work. The following Q&A gives us then some time to address your questions. So again, I encourage you to post those into our chat here. We will then come to an end with another short Menti, just getting an idea of what you took away from this session, and with, of course, sharing our new reports. So again, please stay with us until the end, because that's when the report will come out. So without any further ado, I would now like to hand over to one of the authors of the report, Angie Dazé. Angie is a senior policy advisor and the lead of gender equality for the resilience team at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. She's also a member of the Secretariat of the National Adaptation Plan Global Network, the NAP Global Network. Angie's work focuses on policy and practice related to climate change adaptation and resilience, with a focus on gender equality and social inclusion. She has provided technical support to a number of governments on adaptation planning and has developed practical guidance and tools for vulnerability assessments and adaptation planning with a gender lens. Previously, Angie worked for CARE International and for the Canadian government. Thank you so much, Angie, for being here with us today, and we look forward to your input, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Louisa. And I just want to start by saying what a pleasure it was to work with the GIZ team and also with my colleague from IISD, Annika Tirton, in developing this report. And I'm really happy to provide a brief overview of the content. Next slide, please. So to get us started, I just wanted to lay out the rationale for integrating gender considerations in EBA actions. We know that gendered roles and responsibilities influence people's vulnerability to climate change, as well as their adaptive capacity. And we also know that women, men, and non-binary people play different roles in their households and their communities, and they have different resources and opportunities available to them to adapt. Related to this, in many contexts, we see gender differences in access to and control over natural resources. Women are most often at a disadvantage here, though there are some examples where it's men who face additional barriers. Indigenous and traditional knowledge is often gender specific, and this makes it really important that we harness knowledge from people of all genders. There are imbalances in decision-making power related to adaptation and ecosystem services, and the data shows that women are underrepresented at all levels of decision-making, from the household and community level up to national and international. There's also the issue of who benefits from investments in ecosystem restoration, conservation, and management. Often the benefits are not equitably distributed among people of different genders and social groups. And finally, there are policy mandates for integrating gender, notably in the gender action plans under both the Convention on Biological Diversity and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Next, please. So taking a gender responsive approach it's not only the right thing to do, it can lead to better outcomes from EBA initiatives. There's evidence that integrating gender increases the effectiveness and sustainability of investments in development and adaptation. Taking a rights-based approach to EBA with a focus on gender equality can help to achieve synergies with other objectives like food security and reducing gender-based violence. And it can also lead to more inclusive governance systems by increasing participation of women and people who face discrimination. And lastly, it can increase equity and benefits from investments made in EBA. But I think it's important to keep in mind that when we're talking about achieving gender equality and social inclusion, this is a long-term process of change in societies, in institutions, and in governance systems. So one EBA initiative is unlikely to achieve this on its own. So it's very important that gender-responsive EBA initiatives are linked to and embedded in broader processes and movements, so they contribute to systemic and holistic change over time. Next, please. What you see here is the basic framework for a gender-responsive approach to adaptation that we've applied in the study. This draws on work that IISD has done through the National Adaptation Plan, or NAP Global Network. We identified 3 key dimensions of a gender-responsive approach to adaptation. The first is recognition of gender differences in adaptation needs and capacities. The second is promoting gender equitable participation and influence in adaptation decision-making processes. And the third is gender equitable access to finance and other benefits that result from investments in adaptation. We developed this framework in the context of NAP processes, but in this case, we've applied it to EBA. And we used it as a framework for identifying the building blocks for gender responsive EBA. We've identified 2 building blocks for each of the 3 dimensions that you see here. And the report includes a case example for each of the building blocks. So I'm going to go through the building blocks one by one. And before beginning this, I just want to note that I'm really giving the briefest overview of the case examples for time purposes. And there's a lot more detail and nuance in the report itself. So I would encourage you to check it out because there's some really interesting practice that is being shared. Next slide, please. The first building block is the use of gender analysis to inform EBA planning. And, you know, gender analysis is really the foundation for a gender responsive approach. It explores the roles and relationships between people of different genders, as well as gender specific opportunities, barriers, and decision-making power. We need to take an intersectional approach to gender analysis, recognizing that people have multiple identities and taking into account the context and the different forms of discrimination that people face. Taking an intersectional approach helps us to avoid these unhelpful generalizations and acknowledges the differences both between and among women, men, and non-binary people. Our case example here is from the Saloum Delta in Senegal, where a local NGO called Endegraph Senegal used gender analysis to better understand the respective roles, responsibilities, and relationships in the fisheries sector. Based on the analysis, project activities aim to create opportunities for women to use their knowledge and skills in the sector, while also promoting conservation of the mangrove ecosystem. As a result, there's now better representation of women in the local fishery regulation bodies, and the women that are involved are better able to articulate their needs and priorities. Next, please. The second building block is to have targeted EBA actions that address gender-specific needs and capacities. So again, this is about recognizing that there are gender differences and designing activities to ensure that different needs are met. It may also involve actions to overcome gender-based barriers to resource access and control, or potentially channeling resources on a priority basis to groups that are typically excluded, such as women's groups or Indigenous communities. Here, our example comes from Mauritania, where the local NGO Association pour le Développement et de la Promotion des Droits Humains, ADPDH, took a whole-of-community approach to building resilience. So they had targeted activities to address climate vulnerabilities in women's and men's livelihoods, while also protecting the local ecosystem. Among other results, women's incomes increased and they were able to acquire assets such as mobile phones. And I'd just like to recognize that Hawa Sidibé, the leader of this project, is here with us here today. So merci Hawa pour vos contributions. Next slide, please. The third building block is about engaging underrepresented voices in EBA planning processes. This involves participatory planning processes that bring together all relevant stakeholders. Without concerted attention to ensuring participation of groups that tend to be underrepresented, there is a risk that these processes will reinforce existing social and political exclusion. So we need to ensure that opportunities are created for meaningful participation by all stakeholders. And this may require things like targeted consultations with particular groups, capacity building so that underrepresented voices can meaningfully participate, and engagement of facilitators from the excluded groups. The case example from Ecuador describes a GIZ project which used participatory design of EBA actions, with particular attention to engaging women in the process and building their capacities for organization and awareness raising on issues that are important to them. And one of the results here was that women came together in groups aimed at preventing gender-based violence, which was identified as a significant issue in the community. Next, please. Our fourth building block focuses on promoting gender equitable and inclusive governance of natural resources through EBA actions. So this is about engaging with existing governance systems for natural resources, such as local bylaws, land use plans, conservation policies, and so on, as well as the mechanisms that implement these. When these systems are discriminatory, they can exacerbate vulnerability to climate change and undermine EBA efforts. So implementers of EBA actions should engage with decision makers at different levels to raise awareness of discriminatory policies and practices and to promote inclusive and gender equitable governance. Here, our case example comes from the Harioban program in Nepal, which actively worked to ensure inclusion of women and socially marginalized groups in natural resource management structures. And you're going to hear a lot more about this project in the next part of the webinar as we have their gender expert here with us today. Next, please. Our fifth building block focuses on structures that are set up to implement EBA actions, which often include community-based mechanisms like forest user groups. These may already be in existence, or they may be set up specifically for the EBA action. In either case, attention to gender balance and inclusion of marginalized groups in these structures is essential for a gender-responsive approach. And here we have an example from Vanuatu, where a GIZ project created specific opportunities for women to participate in a coral gardening initiative, which created new sources of income. And what was interesting here was that they found that it was really important in changing attitudes about women's role in the marine sector, which had typically been dominated by male fishers and divers. And women are now more involved in the local conservation committees that have been established to protect the coastal environment. Next, please. Last but not least, our sixth building block focuses on monitoring and evaluation systems, which must be participatory and must track who is benefiting from EBA actions and how. So this requires the use of disaggregated data based on gender as well as other factors and participatory approaches. And having these sort of gender responsive monitoring and evaluation systems can help us to avoid negative impacts, unintended negative impacts. It can help us to adjust strategies that are not effective, and it can help us to ensure that benefits are distributed equitably across genders and social groups when we're implementing EBA actions. Our last case example comes from Honduras, where system to track gender differentiated results. And this enabled them to identify gender blind activities and make adjustments. Next, please. So looking at the literature and the case studies, we have 6 recommendations for taking gender responsive EBA forward. The first is to build capacity for gender analysis within the EBA community. EBA practitioners and policymakers need to understand why gender analysis is essential and have some capacities to apply gender tools. That said, we don't expect that all EBA actors will become gender experts, so we recommend that gender experts be engaged in planning, implementation, and M&E of EBA initiatives. It's essential that we create opportunities for women to take on leadership roles, both within EBA initiatives and more broadly in natural resource governance structures and other relevant decision-making processes. And given the importance of meaningful stakeholder engagement in a gender-responsive approach, we recommend that time and resources be allocated for participatory processes to ensure that this engagement can happen. We need to continue building the evidence base on EBA and gender equality to demonstrate the value of gender-responsive EBA approaches and to ensure that learning is incorporated in approaches over time. And finally, we believe it's essential that EBA initiatives engage with local governance systems, both for sustainability of the initiatives and to advocate for equitable representation of women and marginalized groups. So that's a very brief overview of the report, and I hope you will check it out to get more details. But now we'd like to hear from you. We're going to use Mentimeter, as Louisa mentioned. So please hop on either in your browser or on your phone and go to www.menti.com, and the code is 98499157. And I think the link and the code will be shared in the chat as well. And while that's coming up, so our first question is, which of the 6 building blocks do you think is most important? And just as a reminder, while people are logging in, the 6 building blocks are EBA planning informed by gender analysis, targeted EBA actions that address gender-specific needs and capacities, EBA planning processes actively engage underrepresented voices, EBA actions promote gender equitable and inclusive governance of natural resources. Structures set up to implement EBA actions are gender equitable and inclusive, and participatory and mini systems track who is benefiting from EBA actions and how. Great, and I see we've already got some responses coming in. So it looks like gender analysis is the clear winner so far. Followed by targeted EBA actions and gender equitable and inclusive governance. I think it's really interesting to see the mix of responses, but I think the fact that gender analysis is coming out as the front runner makes a lot of sense, because as I mentioned, this is really the foundation for understanding what issues need to be tackled as we're implementing these EBA initiatives. So it looks like gender analysis first, followed by targeted EBA actions that address gender-specific needs and capacities, and then EBA actions promote gender equitable and inclusive governance of natural resources. So we have one more question that we'd like to ask at this point. For the person who was asking for the code, I think it's been shared in the chat, and you can see it at the top here of the screen here. So our second question is, which building block do you think is most challenging? So we've identified the ones we think are most important, but now I'd like you to think about which of the building blocks is most challenging to achieve in your EBA initiatives. So we've got some responses coming in. It looks like most challenging seems to be setting up structures to implement EBA actions that are gender equitable and inclusive, followed by promoting gender equitable and inclusive governance of natural resources. That's always a challenge because it involves sort of working within the systems that already exist. And then having EBA planning processes that actively engage underrepresented voices coming in third. So thanks very much. We'll have one more Mentimeter at the end of the session, and it'll be the same code, so you can just leave it open. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to pass it back to Louisa.
Thank you very much, Angie. And thank you everyone for participating in this first round of Menti questions. This was already very, very interesting. This is a good point to remind you all again to please post your questions in the chat so that we can get back to them soon. We will have space for this. So yes, there's room for your questions. Please post them in the chat and we will get back to them shortly. But first, let me introduce you to Manorama Sunuwar, who will share insights into a fascinating case example with us. And you've already seen a very brief overview of the case we're going to look into now in Angie's presentation. Manorama is Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Coordinator at CARE Nepal and the Harioban program, and she has been since 2019. Before joining Harioban, she was a gender specialist at UNDP in Suriname, overseeing gender affairs in the Global Climate Change Alliance project. She has more than 15 years of experience in the development sector with a focus on gender equality and social inclusion, indigenous peoples' rights, environment and peace building in NGOs and INGOs, and UN agencies in countries like Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Suriname. Welcome, Manorama, and thank you for joining us today. And I hope you can see and hear as well, and if possible, turn on your video.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone.
Great. Yes, it's working. Thank you, Manorama, for being here with us. And first and foremost, Manorama, I would like to hear from you whether you could tell us a bit more about the Harioban project.
Harioban project, as name suggests, is an EBA project. The literal translation of Harioban in English is green and healthy forest. And it was recently the project has been phased out, but it was implemented for around 10 years with the aim to reduce threat to biodiversity and to reduce the adverse impact of climate change in Nepal. The project was jointly implemented by WWF, which is a worldwide renowned organization in biodiversity conservation, and CARE Nepal, which is the people-centric organization has expertise in climate change, adaptation, and social mobilization. And globally also, these two organizations had already collaborated to implement similar project. And similarly, we also had two national NGOs in consortium as consortium partners. And now, first one was Federation of Community Forest Users of Nepal. It has got huge network across the country of community forest user groups. And the other one is National Trust for Nature Conservation, which is also a renowned organization in biodiversity conservation, and it works closely with the government. And the project was funded by USAID. And in short, the program emphasized in linkages between people and the forest and was designed to benefit both people and the nature in Nepal.
Thank you for this first overview. Now, could you tell us a little bit about why gender equality and social inclusion were considered to be a priority for the project?
Let me brief you about the context of our country, because maybe it was because of our context also. Like Nepal is rich in ethnic, cultural, and religious diversity. However, people from all ethnic or religious background do not equally enjoy the benefit of natural resources. And our country also had gone through a decade-long conflict. And one of the root causes of conflict was inequality, particularly gender inequality and social exclusion. So in context of climate change adaptation, the climate change, as we know that climate change has differently can affect both men and women, and also it has got proportionate, impact on women and marginalized community. When I say marginalized community in Nepal, it includes indigenous people and Dalit community and Madhesi community and religious minority like Muslim community and people with disability and climate vulnerable people. So, however, what we notice that this group are found to have very limited capacity and also knowledge to cope with the impact of climate change, and they also have limited access to the technology. So again, women and marginalized community, both men and women, are the greatest contributor in context of Nepal in biodiversity conservation, but they are underrepresented in the decision-making level, and also due to some social norms and gender stereotype, their leadership is not easily acceptable. So these are maybe some of the reason why our project considers gender as a cross-cutting and important theme for our project.
Yeah, thank you. And very interesting that this was also a bit of a strategic approach that you took. So looking at strategies, actually, which specific strategies did you use to integrate gender equality and social inclusion in your project?
As for the strategy, yes, we had two major strategy. First of all, that is, we try to mainstream gender equality and social inclusion within the big component of the program. That means one was climate change adaptation and another was biodiversity conservation. And also we had 4 partners, so we try to integrate gender within the institutional level. So we invested CARE being lead in gender equality and social inclusion, try to build the capacity of other partners as well to mainstream it in institutional level. And at the same time, we had a JC standalone initiative as well. So particularly, it was to empower women and marginalized people to build their capacity and bridge the gap. So for this, we had some approaches like CLAC. In short, we call CLAC, but it's actually Community Learning and Action Center. It's a loose network of women and marginalized group. And it also was instrumental to tool of creating mass who challenge the harmful social norms and discriminatory practices, gender-based violence within the conservation sector and also in climate change adaptation context. And the program was also supported around more than 500 CLAC, Community Learning and Action Center. So we, at the same time, we also realized that engaging men is very crucial, particularly for the social transformation. So in terms of JC champions or change agent, a local resource person, we keep on engaging men at the same time, and issue-based partnership was another approach. And at the same time, we had some of the livelihood support, but this livelihood support, we ensure that it should be JC focus. So needs and the capacity of gender and different gender and the different people belonging to the different marginalized communities was considered while supporting it. And JC friendly tools and technology also was supported as our one of the approach. And we must say that we kept on doing policy for the gender responsive policy advocacy. So those were some of our strategies and tools.
Great, thank you. Very, very interesting. Also, the variety of different tools you used, and yeah, the engagement of different genders in your work. Really great. Thank you for sharing. Now, looking a bit more at, let's say, the difficult side of doing something like this, which challenges did you encounter in addressing gender inequality and social exclusion in your work?
As for the challenges, yeah. First of all, the project was technical in terms of it was not like social kind of project. So And it was being jointly implemented by 4 different organizations having different level of understanding and capacity on JC, gender equality and social inclusion. And that's why at the beginning of the project, it was pretty challenging for us to build common understanding on JC, and also in some cases it was so hard to persuade the team members to integrate some of the agenda of gender equality and social inclusion. For example, addressing gender-based issues of addressing gender-based violences, and also working on the social transformative issues. So at the beginning it was hard, but later on, after like developing capacity and working together, we had kind of understanding, and it was smooth later on. And similarly with the budget and funding part, also one of the challenges, because gender equality and social inclusion was cross-cutting theme. So it didn't have like dedicated budget, though we had action plan and we had developed a list of actions, but still we had to like continuously lobby and do advocacy to prioritize the gender equality and social inclusion agenda. So and many times like we realize that this is often considered the responsibility of JC focal point or JC expert within the consortium partner. So that was also one of the challenge we realized. And while working with, while collaborating with the government and also with the community, we often like realize that just gender equality and social inclusion agenda is a bit less prioritized within the program. So we had to make an continuous effort to like bring it on the table so that they can realize the importance of gender issues of gender equality to address. So these were some of the key issues that challenges we faced during the program.
Yeah, thank you also for going into these. You've mentioned GESI a couple of times now, and it already came up in the chat. Do you quickly want to say what it stands for again so that it's clear to everyone?
Oh, I'm extremely sorry for that. So I have got like habit of saying and social inclusion. In short, we call JC. So JC is very common in Nepal.
Thank you for sharing. I had a quick interruption here, but I hope that it could be heard by everyone else. So now sort of going back more to the success stories in relation to gender equality and social inclusion. What were your biggest successes with your work?
Yeah, after implementing this Horibon program for around a decade, we also had some of the interesting, achievement as well. For example, we've been able to implement gender equality and social inclusion related provisions in natural resource management sector. For instance, there were already some progressive policies and provisions of forest development guideline. So forest development guideline is a document. It was binding document which often guide community forest user group. Around 20,000, more than 20,000 community forest user groups are guided by this guidelines. So, but there it has already some of the interesting like progressive provisions within the document. For example, it has mandate 50% of women. There should be representation of 50% of women within the executive committee, or it has also had some provisions related to equitable benefit sharing for women and marginalized communities. But these provisions had not been effectively implemented. But when we made effort in like we realized that some of the major beneficiaries were not well aware of these provisions, and due to lack of capacity of the natural resource management group, they were not being implement this. So we made effort in like bridging this gap, and we've been able. So now I can proudly say that more than within our working area for Audubon program, most of the community forest user group have developed their, they had integrated gender equality and social inclusion related provisions within their forest operation plan, and some of them have already like developed their action plan, gender equality and social inclusion action plan as well. And these women who have been trained through the capacity through the community learning action center also are coming forward, and also marginalized community have coming forward to demand their rights within the community forest. So that was one of the achievement. And second achievement, I would say it is linked with the first achievement, but we had contributed in enhancing representation of women and marginalized community at the decision-making level of NRM groups and climate change adaptation related committee. The program directly, capacitated more than 13,000 women and marginalized community groups, people of marginalized group. So as a result, we had conducted one study, and it shows that 87% of leadership position of Audubon supported local entity within our project area is now filled with these groups, people of this group. So now we also can see interesting like case studies and success stories of this emerging women leader who are already in the leadership position of local government and forest related committee. And thirdly, also our program also had supported to develop GIZ responsive policy. So Audubon program engaged with liaise with the government of Nepal, particularly Ministry of Forest and Environment. So more than 60 policies has been developed under the climate change adaptation and biodiversity conservation. And these policies are not gender blind. These are the gender sensitive. Most of them are gender responsive. So I can see the local adaptation plan that's supported by Audubon program as totally gender responsive and being successfully implemented within the program areas. And the ministry recently has developed gender equality and social inclusion strategy and action plan, and for the first time this action plan. So it is in process of endorsement, but Audubon had contributed like to develop it. So these are some of the successes we proud on.
Wow, that's really impressive. Thanks for sharing. And it sounds like there's so much more in it. Like it would definitely be great to look more into this. And I also encourage everyone to read more about it in our report. We are running a bit short on time, so I need to cut my last question short a little bit. Can you maybe just like in one sentence give one piece of advice to our practitioners here with us today, how to better integrate gender equality and social inclusion? Just in one sentence, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I would say while integrating gender equality and social inclusion, it is very important to empower the women and the marginalized community together. I mean, separately, we should have some specific program for them. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for us to mainstream, particularly to make it a gender responsive program. That is what I think.
Thank you so much, Manorama. This was extremely insightful. Thank you very, very much for sharing. And I feel like there would be so much more to talk about. But we also already have lots of questions from our audience here today. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, I would like to look into those now so that there's also some room for that and for both Angie and you, Manorama, to respond to these. Maybe starting with a question to Angie. There's a question on the difference of rights-based approaches or the concept of rights-based approaches and whether it's identified as similar to gender or even interchangeably. Could you say a few words on this, Angie?
Sure. I wouldn't say that gender responsive and rights-based are interchangeable, but I think it's very difficult to tackle gender inequalities without tackling the denial of women's rights. But I think also we are looking not just at gender, but as Manorama has spoken quite a lot about, there are also other groups who face discrimination and who aren't able to realize their rights. So a rights-based approach is not just about gender, it's sort of looking at any group that is unable to realize their rights and trying to lift the barriers that make that so. So they're very interconnected, but I wouldn't say that gender responsive and rights-based are interchangeable.
Okay, thank you. Then I would have a question for Manorama. Could you say a bit more on the ways in which women are leaders in conservation in Nepal?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't get it.
Yes, so there's a question, I think, a bit more oriented towards which roles do women take on sort of in leading positions in conservation in Nepal? Like, can you share a bit more about the different ways in which they do in your country context?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Yeah, actually, women's role in conservation is like most of the rural area, particularly, is populated by women than the men in our context. And they do agricultural work, and in conservation sector particularly, their work was to collect the fodder and that firewood from the conservation area, and also they contribute in forest patrolling and plantation of forests. So earlier, before implementing our program, we see their engagement in very low level, but now this engagement is gradually increasing, and there are more women are coming in front and in a decision making level, and also to contribute like to conserve the endangered species and those things, because they, I think, learn they enhance their knowledge, so their engagement is like improving.
Okay, thank you for sharing. There's another question, and I'm going to read it out explicitly, Angie, and I'm actually going to point it in your direction because it's a bit tricky, but I think it's actually very interesting because it's quite conceptual. I believe I understand the difference between equality, equity, and social inclusion. However, I would like to ask, why is social inclusion still a key element if equity and equality cannot happen without inclusion? If it's not clear, I might actually ask the person to speak up and explain it a little bit. So, Angie, does this, like, what do you understand from this question? Can I myself, I'm not completely sure I have the separation clear here.
I think I understand the question.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's so if we're talking about achieving gender equality, inclusion must be part of that. Mm-hmm. So why are we talking about both gender equality and social inclusion?
Yeah, okay.
And the reason for that, and Manorama might also want to come in on this, but the reason for that is that we're not only looking at gender-based difference, we're also looking at intersectional factors like age, or someone having a disability, or someone being from an indigenous community. And there are all these other factors that can also perpetuate discrimination. So a woman, not all women have the same experience. An indigenous woman has a different experience from a non-indigenous woman, or an elderly man has a different experience than a young man. And so we talk about gender equality and social inclusion because we don't only want to focus on gender, but we're also trying to look at these intersectional factors that also influence people's experiences, their capacities, their needs. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but that was how I understood it.
Thank you.
To me, it did. Manorama, do you have something to add to this?
Yeah, mostly already it has been covered by Angie, but I'd just like to say that some of the group may have like cultural barriers, and some of the group may have like social harmful practices. Because of that harmful practices, it barriers them to participate in conservation or to get benefit from the natural resource. So, and some of them may have language barrier. So we have to address that also, both men and women from those excluded community. So maybe that is why we have to consider social inclusion as well.
Thank you. Manorama, I would actually have a follow-up question, which, however, is more linked to your specific project work again. Were you able to replicate the project in any other areas, and how long did it take you to sustain such project? How long did it take to sort of get it to a point where it could also maybe function a bit by itself to a certain extent?
Yeah, I won't say we replicate all the project initiatives, because Horizon itself was a very huge project. So some of the gender-related activities has been replicated, particularly by CARE Nepal in its other projects area. For example, some practices of empowering women's group through the Community Learning and Action Center, and providing gender equality, particularly gender-friendly tools and technology to the women. And also some of our consortium partner, for example, we had FECOFON, Federation of Community Users Group in Nepal. It has replicated some of its action in addressing gender-based violence within the community forest areas. So they have already developed action plan, and they are planning to scale it out in the rest of the areas where the project has not been implemented. So some actions are being replicated. Yes. Sorry.
You're muted, Louisa.
Yeah, you're muted.
Sorry. Now, thank you. Thank you for this response, Manorama. And Angie, I would have another question for you. So first of all, there's a thank you for this very interesting presentation. And what would be your recommendations on how to best advocate for implementing a gender responsive approach to EBA in cultural settings where there might be reluctance, for example, by male leaders to do so?
Yeah, great
Actually,
question.
it could be a question for both.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's some great experience to share, but maybe I can start with a couple of thoughts and then I'll hand it over to Manorama. I mean, for me, one thing is really about building the evidence base. Like I said in my presentation, that it's not just the right thing to do, it will actually lead to better outcomes. So I think convincing people, demonstrating that, taking a gender responsive approach is fundamental to achieving the goals of ecosystem-based adaptation is a good way to convince them that, this is something, it's just fundamental. It has to happen. It's not optional. And then the other thing that I would say is, I think supporting women's collective action is essential. I think the power of sort of women coming together in groups to tackle the issues, and this comes out in a number of the case examples, and including in Nepal, and I think that's just essential. But then also not framing this as a women's issue. We need to be working with men, we need to engage men, and we need to create dialogue so that there's a better mutual understanding of what the issues are and what the way forward is for, achieving gender equality and social inclusion. And I'll stop there because I think Manorama has lots to add.
Yes, Angie has already covered a lot. I just like to add some of my experience from the Nepal. But in Nepal, particularly, men's engagement was effective in empowering women and addressing the social issues. So for that, we had one strategy, like we nominated men champions, some of the influencing men within the community level. So we nominated as a JC champion, gender equality and social inclusion champion, and also some of the change agents were nominated in that way, and they trend oriented on women's issues, and we capacitated them with various training, and we provided them, exposure visit and cross learning, and we engaged, and they themselves motivated. Now I'm really proud to see some of the leaders that they are volunteer, but they are so committed and dedicated to engage women in the conservation and to promote their rights, and to not only for women and also for the social issues of social exclusion and harmful social practices within the environment sector. So these are some of our experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the two of you for answering this question. I would have one last one, Manorama, directed at you. So in your project work, at which stages did you integrate gender issues? And this was particularly linked to sort of the climate change components that you had in your works. At which stages did you include gender issues?
Thank you for the question, but I really don't know the stages. But what I can say is when we implement climate change related action, activities within the our project area, gender equality and social inclusion is equally integrated, because CARE is leading gender equality and also climate change. So wherever the CARE had this program, they have well integrated. For example, we conducted, we developed a framework called different DIA framework, so differently impacted assessment and response plan. So in that response plan, we directly consulted, we worked together with the other approaches of gender equality. So climate change action also worked together with that, and as a result, we identified how we developed the tool how the climate change can impact women and different people, marginalized community. And at the same time, while implementing local adaptation plan, LAPA, so we mobilize some of in some areas, we mobilize women's network to implement that, to develop the plan. So it is closely integrated, but still there are some gaps. But so I cannot say the level, but it is closely integrated, and it was gender responsive, definitely.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it was also more on this was already really helpful because it wasn't on linked to a specific conceptual approach, but more where you sort of placed it. So this was really helpful. Thank you. And thanks to both of you for answering all these questions. This was really, really interesting. And before we now come to an end, I would like to go to our second and last short Menti poll, where we will kind of look at what the main takeaways from the audience were for today. So I would kindly ask all of you to join us on Menti again. So www.menti.com with the same code as earlier, which was now also again posted in the chat. 984991. Sorry, now I lost it. 9157 is the code. And we just want to hear what your key takeaways are from this session on gender responsive EBA. What did you learn? What are you taking with you? And I will give everyone a moment to join and put in your answers. The code is again 98499157. Okay, we can see that people are taking away that it's very important to include gender and the GIZ tool. Interesting. Gender responsiveness begins with a good gender analysis. So gender analysis, which also came out earlier, is an important point. Empowering marginalized people along with women, or looking at gender. We also need to look at other dimensions. Interesting. We need to build an evidence base. Yes, also the importance of engaging all genders in this. Yes, systematic capacity building of the target groups. Yes, we need to do more, but a lot of good things are already happening. Intersectionality as a key point for achieving gender inclusion. Wow, so many great things coming in. Thank you. Maybe we can also try to capture this somehow, everything that is coming in here, because I think it'll also for us be really interesting to look at this. Yes, women's collective action is powerful. Thank you. Wow, great. We unfortunately have to come to an end now. Thank you for sharing your key learnings. And again, we'll see if we can save them, which you normally can on Menti, so that would be great. We have reached the end of the session, and this means that we can finally share our new report toward gender-responsive ecosystem-based adaptation, why it's needed and how to get there. And the link should be shared in the chat now. And we hope that it is a useful resource for you, and we look forward to hearing from you about it. So if you have any feedback on it, that would also be great. With this, I would like to thank you all for being here today, with a special thanks to Angie and Manorama for all your input and all the questions you answered, and to everyone who supported the event in the background. As mentioned earlier, the recording will be available on adaptationcommunity.net very soon, and we will also send around the link to the recording as soon as possible. If you have any questions or feedback, kindly reach out to us via email on eba@giz.de. And thank you very much, and we look forward to continuously working with you on this topic of EBA and gender. And we wish you a pleasant day or evening. Thank you very much, and take care.